The sun had barely begun to dip beneath the horizon in Benton, Arkansas, casting an amber glow over the suburban neighborhood. The streets were quiet, with children playing on their front lawns and neighbors exchanging pleasantries over garden fences. In the midst of this tranquil scene was the Chadwick family, David, Jessica, and their two young children, a family that seemed to have it all. They were the picture of suburban bliss, a husband and wife, both in their 30s, working hard to provide a good life for their kids. Their house, nestled in the heart of a safe community, was a typical middle-class home, complete with a white picket fence and a well-kept lawn. From the outside, everything appeared normal, but appearances can be deceiving. David Chadwick, a man in his mid-30s, had been living with mental health issues for years. His struggles, however, had remained hidden from most people. To the outside world, he was an average man, doing his best to maintain a normal life for the sake of his wife and children. But behind the scenes, David's mental health had deteriorated. He had been battling feelings of anger, isolation, and frustration that no one truly understood. Jessica, his wife, had been the supportive partner, trying to keep things together for their family. But even she couldn't see the storm brewing inside David. Jessica, a loving mother and wife, had always been the glue that held their family together. She was a devoted wife, always standing by David despite the challenges they faced together. But even she could not see how deeply David's mental struggles had penetrated. He kept most of his emotions bottled up, and over time, his anger began to spill out in ways that frightened her. Jessica had seen the signs. David's temper was unpredictable, and his outbursts, although not frequent, were terrifying when they occurred. Their two children, a young boy and girl, had been growing up in a household that had moments of happiness, but also undercurrents of tension. The children were unaware of the growing darkness around them. They were still innocent, unaware of the threat looming over them. The home that had once been filled with laughter and joy was now a place where fear had begun to settle, like a thick fog that no one could see, but everyone could feel. The nights were the hardest for David. He often found himself alone with his thoughts, staring into the dark as waves of anxiety and depression overwhelmed him. The weight of his mental struggles was becoming unbearable, but he couldn't bring himself to ask for help. In a moment of frustration, David turned inward, refusing to speak to anyone about the depths of his despair. Instead, he sank deeper into isolation, pushing his family further away, even as they tried to support him. The days leading up to the tragic events of that fateful night were filled with subtle warning signs. Jessica noticed David's behavior becoming more erratic, but she didn't know how to address it. Their conversations, once filled with love and warmth, had turned colder. David would often retreat into himself, snapping at Jessica when she tried to discuss their relationship or his mental health. But Jessica didn't give up. She believed that, with time, things would get better. She had faith in David and in their family. On the evening before the murders, everything seemed to be going well, at least on the surface. David came home from work and the family sat down for dinner. They shared a meal, exchanged stories about their day, and laughed. For a moment, everything felt normal, but the normalcy was fleeting. The tension, which had been building over the past few weeks, was about to explode. As the evening wore on, David grew quiet. He didn't engage in conversation as he usually did. Jessica, always the attentive wife, noticed the change in him, but didn't press the issue. She didn't want to cause more stress by asking questions. Little did she know, that decision would haunt her forever. That night, after their children had gone to bed, the calm of the evening shattered. David, overwhelmed by the suffocating weight of his mental health issues and his inability to express himself, erupted in a violent outburst. The man who had once been her partner, her confidant, and the father of her children was now a stranger filled with rage. His anger was no longer something Jessica could calm with gentle words or soft touches. It was something far darker. The exact details of what transpired that night are not fully clear, but the result was undeniable. Jessica's life was cut short by the very man who had sworn to protect her. In a fit of violence, David ended Jessica's life in a way that was both brutal and terrifying. The shock of the act reverberated throughout the house, but David was too far gone to recognize the extent of his actions. In the midst of his rage, he turned his attention to the children, his own flesh and blood, who were now unwitting witnesses to a nightmarish scene. The silence that followed Jessica's death in the Chadwick household was deafening, a cruel contrast to the cacophony of emotion that had preceded it. David's rage had consumed him entirely, and what was once a house full of life and love was now an abandoned, lifeless tomb. The fury that David had suppressed for so long had been unleashed, leaving behind a trail of destruction that no one could have anticipated. As the night wore on, David's mind seemed to spiral even further into madness. In the wake of the violence, David sat motionless. He was not crying, nor was he speaking. There was nothing but the hollow stare of a man who had crossed a line he could never return from. It was as though the man who had lived in that house for so long was no longer present. In his place was a broken shell, struggling to comprehend the enormity of his actions. His mind raced with confusion, guilt, and strangely a sense of relief. The internal battle that had raged within him for so long, the emotional conflict between love and hatred, sanity and madness, had finally erupted into a horrifying conclusion. But David's inner turmoil was far from over. With Jessica's lifeless body lying on the floor, David's attention turned to his children. They were still asleep, unaware of the horrific events that had just unfolded. They lay in their beds, blissfully ignorant of the chaos their world had become. But David knew that the children could never be allowed to live. His twisted reasoning, born of his fragile mental state, told him that there was no going back now. If he had already destroyed the one person who had loved him unconditionally, he reasoned, what difference did it make if he destroyed the rest of his family? It's impossible to know exactly what went through David's mind in those final moments before he acted. But the cruelty of his decision, one so callous and irreversible, suggests that in his mind there was no other way. He had already burned every bridge with Jessica, and now he would ensure that no one was left to stand in his way. The fate of the children was sealed with that same sense of brutality. His young son and daughter, completely unaware of what was happening around them, were murdered in cold blood. The details of their deaths are chilling, as the innocence of youth was extinguished by the hands of the man who was supposed to protect them. These two children, whose only crime was being born into a family where darkness had begun to fester, paid the ultimate price. After the murders, David, still consumed by his inner demons, did not immediately flee the scene. For hours he stayed in the house, surrounded by the lifeless bodies of his wife and children. His mind had seemingly gone into a haze, and the reality of his actions was just beginning to sink in. But rather than face the consequences, David's next move was to escape, both from the scene of the crime and from the suffocating guilt that was slowly consuming him. He left the house without saying a word to anyone. He was gone, leaving behind nothing but the carnage he had wrought. His escape was quick, a frantic flight from the scene that left investigators with no immediate leads as to his whereabouts. It was as though he had vanished into thin air, with no trace of where he might have gone. His disappearance sparked a search that would span days, with law enforcement scrambling to piece together the fragments of his life in order to find him. But David's actions did not go unnoticed. The community, still reeling from the violence that had just unfolded, was thrust into chaos. News of the Chadwick family's brutal slaying spread quickly, and the entire town of Benton was left in shock. Neighbors, friends, and even distant relatives were left grappling with the reality of what had happened. How could this have occurred? What went wrong? And most importantly, how could someone like David Chadwick, a man they had known and trusted, be capable of such an act? For Jessica's family, the loss was unfathomable. Her parents, devastated by the news, could hardly believe that their daughter, someone they had raised with love and care, was now gone. How could the man she had married, the father of her children, have done this? The questions mounted, but there would be no easy answers. The family was left with nothing but grief and confusion. As the search for David began, investigators scrambled to uncover clues that would explain what had happened inside the Chadwick home. They found signs of a man on the edge, struggling with his own demons. Interviews with neighbors and friends revealed that David had become increasingly withdrawn in the months leading up to the murders. He had stopped attending social gatherings, cut ties with many of his old friends, and become more and more isolated. His mental health had been a topic of discussion for some time, but no one had ever suspected that things would escalate to such an extent. The investigators learned that David had sought help for his mental health issues in the past, but his treatment had been sporadic at best. He had been prescribed medication for depression and anxiety, but whether or not he had been following his treatment plan remained unclear. The signs were there. David had been struggling for years, but no one had been able to recognize the extent of his pain. It was a tragedy waiting to happen, and no one could have predicted just how devastating the outcome would be. While law enforcement pursued every lead in an attempt to find David, the community was left in a state of limbo. People locked their doors at night, fearing the possibility that a man they once knew could be walking among them. In the days that followed, the investigation continued to unravel more details about David's life. It became clear that he had been harboring deep feelings of resentment and frustration, which had ultimately culminated in the horrific murder of his family. But as the manhunt for David grew more intense, one question loomed large. Where had he gone? The days following the brutal murders of Jessica and her children were marked by an unrelenting search for David Chadwick. Law enforcement agencies from Benton, along with the Arkansas State Police, intensified their efforts to locate him. But the man who had once been a familiar face in the community had seemingly vanished without a trace. There were no phone records, no sightings of him leaving town, and no clues as to his whereabouts. It was as if he had completely disappeared from the face of the earth. The small town of Benton, which had prided itself on being a quiet and peaceful place, was suddenly thrust into the harsh reality of a chilling crime. People who had once known David were left in disbelief. How could someone they had spoken to at the local coffee shop, someone they had seen in their neighborhood for years, commit such an unimaginable act? The horror of the situation was compounded by the fact that the killer was someone they could have run into at any time. The town felt violated, its sense of safety shattered. For the Chadwick family's friends and relatives, the pain was compounded by their inability to understand the events that led to such brutality. They could not wrap their heads around the idea that David, a man they had known for years, was responsible for ending the lives of his wife and children in such a violent manner. He had been, in many ways, just like them, a husband, a father, someone trying to make his way through life. How had everything gone so terribly wrong? As the search for David grew more intense, investigators began to piece together the puzzle of his life, trying to find clues that would lead them to his whereabouts. The more they uncovered about his past, the more they realized that the warning signs had been there all along. David had a history of mental health issues, struggles with anger, and episodes of depression that had grown worse over the years. But the real question remained, why had he crossed the line this time? Why had he decided to act on his darkest impulses? For those close to David, the truth was hard to swallow. His family, particularly his parents, were devastated by the loss of their daughter-in-law and grandchildren. But at the same time, they struggled to understand how their son had become a murderer. They couldn't reconcile the David they had known with the man capable of such violence. And yet the evidence was clear. David had been living in a state of mental turmoil, and that had driven him to commit the unthinkable. In the meantime, the town had become a place of constant unease. Neighbors who had once smiled at David in passing now found themselves locking their doors at night, unsure whether the man they had once known was lurking in the shadows. Fear hung over Benton like a cloud. Every face seemed suspect, and every car that drove through town drew attention. David's absence only added to the unease. If he wasn't dead, where was he? Was he still in the area? Had he fled to another state? Or was he lying in wait, preparing to strike again? The investigation began to turn inward as authorities examined David's past, looking for any possible indication that this was not a random act of violence. They delved into his relationships with friends, co-workers, and family, hoping to find a pattern or any warning signs that could have predicted the tragedy. What they found was a man who had been struggling for years, but one who had hidden his pain behind a mask of normalcy. David had always been a private person. He didn't share his emotions easily, and he certainly didn't seek help when he was struggling. He had been in and out of therapy over the years, but his commitment to treatment was often half-hearted. He took his medication sporadically and often resisted talking about his mental health. Friends who had known him for years admitted that they had seen changes in him, but they didn't realize the extent of his inner turmoil. His marriage to Jessica had been rocky at times, but they had always managed to work through their problems. However, those closest to them began to see that something was off in the months leading up to the murders. David had become withdrawn, snapping at Jessica over trivial matters, and there was a growing sense that he was no longer the man he once was. Jessica had tried to keep things together for the sake of the children, but it was clear that her husband was no longer the man she had fallen in love with. He had changed, and she had noticed. She had tried, in her own way, to reach out to him, to bring him back to the family they had once been. But it was too late. David's mental state continued to deteriorate, and he became increasingly erratic in his behavior. He started withdrawing from social activities, cutting ties with old friends, and spending more time alone. He was no longer the outgoing, friendly man who had once been so involved in his community. He had become a stranger, a man who seemed to be at war with himself. The signs were there, but no one could have predicted how this would end. The night of the murders was the culmination of everything David had been holding inside. It was a breaking point, an explosion of pent-up rage and frustration. But the question remained, what triggered the final act? Was it a single event, or had it been building for years? As the investigation continued, law enforcement received a breakthrough. One of David's co-workers, a man who had known him for years, came forward with new information. He had been in contact with David shortly before the murders. David had seemed distant, distracted, and agitated. He had talked about feeling overwhelmed and unable to cope with his emotions. He mentioned how he felt like everything in his life was falling apart. But no one had taken his words seriously. It was just another day in a man's life who had been struggling for years. David's co-workers described him as a man who kept his problems to himself. They had seen the cracks in his facade, but no one had ever imagined it would come to this. It wasn't until after the murders that people began to piece together the clues that pointed to the deep, hidden despair that had driven David to kill. The community was still in shock. The discovery of David's mental health struggles didn't make the crime any easier to understand. Mental illness, though a significant factor in his actions, did not excuse what he had done. The loss of Jessica and the children was irreparable, and no amount of understanding could bring them back. As the manhunt for David continued, there was a growing sense of dread. What had started as a search for a fugitive had now become a hunt for answers. Where had David gone? Was he dead or alive? And what, if anything, could explain the horror he had inflicted on his own family? The search for David Chadwick was relentless. Law enforcement agencies were combing through every possible lead, trying to track down the man who had so violently destroyed his own family. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of David. Benton, once a peaceful town, had now become a place of heightened anxiety and suspicion. Everyone was asking the same questions. Where was David? Had he left the state? Or worse, had he already taken his own life, unable to cope with the guilt of his actions? As the days passed, hope began to dwindle. David had vanished without a trace, leaving behind a trail of confusion and sorrow. Despite this, investigators were determined to find him. They had to understand why he had committed such a heinous act, and they had to ensure that he faced justice for what he had done. A break in the case came when investigators discovered a series of phone records and emails that David had sent in the days before the murders. These communications painted a picture of a man who was unraveling mentally and emotionally. In one email, sent just days before the killings, David wrote about feeling trapped and overwhelmed by the pressures of his life. He confessed that he had been unable to find a way out of the darkness that had enveloped him. The messages were chilling, revealing the depth of his despair and his growing sense of hopelessness. Despite his emotional turmoil, David had not directly threatened his family in these messages, nor had he explicitly mentioned any plans to harm them. The tone was cryptic, and those who read the emails later admitted that they hadn't thought much of them at the time. They were just ramblings of a man who seemed to be at the end of his rope. But looking back, the signs were all there. David was in pain, and that pain had been festering for years, building up until it exploded in the most tragic of ways. The emails also revealed another unsettling detail. David had been researching ways to disappear. He had spent hours online looking into escape routes, methods of evading the law, and places where he could hide. It was clear now that he had planned to flee after committing the murders. although the reasons for this were still unclear. Had he been preparing to leave his family behind long before that night? Or had he decided in the aftermath of the killings that he couldn't face the consequences of his actions? As investigators continued to dig deeper into David's life, they learned more about his plans and his state of mind. The more they uncovered, the more it became apparent that David's mental state had deteriorated beyond repair. He had been living in a world of isolation, struggling with anger and depression, but had been unwilling, or perhaps unable, to seek help. His pride, his fear of judgment, and his inability to open up had driven him into a dark corner from which he could not escape. While the investigation into David's life continued, the manhunt had reached a fever pitch. Local and state authorities were working in tandem, deploying a combination of helicopters, search dogs, and teams of officers to scour every inch of the region. The theory that David had fled the state was becoming increasingly likely, and investigators were considering the possibility that he had crossed state lines to avoid detection. It was a federal agent who would eventually find the breakthrough they had been hoping for. A tip came in from a motel owner in a neighboring state who reported seeing a man matching David's description staying at his establishment. The man had checked in using a false name and had paid for his room in cash. The tip was too valuable to ignore, and within hours, a team of officers was on their way to the motel. When they arrived, the scene was tense. Officers scoured the premises, checking every room and questioning anyone who might have seen David. The search seemed to be dragging on for hours with no result. But then, just as hope was beginning to wane, they received a call from a local clerk. She had seen a man who resembled David Chadwick lingering near the back entrance of the motel, and she had noticed something unusual. The man was wearing a heavy coat, despite the sweltering summer heat. The authorities had finally caught their first real lead. As they converged on the motel, they found David sitting alone in a small, dingy room. He appeared to be disoriented, as if he had been waiting for something, or perhaps someone. The look on his face was one of resignation, as though he knew that the moment he had been running from had finally arrived. David was arrested without incident. There were no confrontations, no standoff, just the quiet surrender of a man who had no more fight left in him. He was taken into custody, where he was formally charged with the murders of his wife and children. The officers who had apprehended him described him as eerily calm during the arrest, almost as though he had expected this moment to come. When David was finally booked into jail, he did not resist or try to explain his actions. In the following days, as the shock of his capture spread through the media, many were left grappling with the same question. Why? Why had David done this? What could possibly have driven him to murder the very people who had loved him? As the investigation continued, it became clear that David had been consumed by mental illness. But that alone didn't explain everything. His breakdown had been years in the making, but the exact moment when he decided to act on his darkest impulses remained elusive. What had caused him to snap? Was it the mounting pressure from his deteriorating marriage? The isolation that had begun to define his life? Or was it something deeper? A momentary loss of control that spiraled into tragedy. David's arrest marked the beginning of a long and painful journey through the criminal justice system. As his trial approached, the community and his family were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives. The grief of losing Jessica and the children was immeasurable, and the scars of this tragedy would last a lifetime. But as David prepared to face the consequences of his actions, there was a sense of finality. The man who had once been part of this community was now just another criminal. A man whose inner demons had led him down a path of destruction and despair. The days following David Chadwick's capture were filled with intense media coverage, and the small town of Benton was forever marked by the brutal murders of Jessica and their 2 children. As the wheels of justice began to turn, the community braced itself for the inevitable trial. The question on everyone's mind was simple. Why had David Chadwick, a man once loved by his family and community, gone so far as to murder his wife and children in cold blood? David's arrest had brought the town some relief, but the answers they sought remained elusive. The pain of the loss still loomed over the Chadwick family, leaving a void that could never be filled. The family members of Jessica and the children were left to pick up the pieces of their shattered lives, and for them, no amount of justice could ever bring back what they had lost. The lead up to David's trial was marked by intense speculation and emotional turmoil. Local news outlets were obsessed with the details of the case, and the town was consumed with questions. What kind of man would do something like this? What drove David to murder his family? Was he mentally unstable, or was there a darker, more calculated reason behind the crime? David's defense attorneys argued that he had been suffering from severe mental health issues at the time of the murders. They painted a picture of a man who had been struggling with depression, anxiety, and overwhelming anger for years. They claimed that David had been unable to control his emotions and that his mental state had played a significant role in his decision to commit such an atrocious act. This defense, while not an excuse for what he had done, sought to establish that David was not entirely responsible for his actions due to his mental illness. The prosecution, on the other hand, painted a very different picture of David Chadwick. They argued that, while mental health issues may have contributed to his actions, they did not excuse his brutal murder of his wife and children. The prosecution focused on the fact that David had planned the murders, leaving behind a trail of evidence that indicated he had been carefully considering his options in the days leading up to the crime. They also pointed out that David had made a conscious decision to flee after the murders, further demonstrating that he understood the consequences of his actions. As the trial unfolded, the courtroom became a place where the tragedy of the Chadwick family was laid bare for all to see. Witnesses testified about David's behavior in the months leading up to the murders. His co-workers spoke of his growing isolation, his erratic behavior, and the disturbing emails he had sent in the days before the killings. Family members described how David had become a different person, how his anger seemed to grow unchecked, and how they had tried to reach out to him but had been unable to help. One of the most heart-wrenching moments came when Jessica's parents took the stand. They spoke of the daughter they had lost, the pain of knowing that she and their grandchildren had been taken from them in such a violent and senseless way. They described Jessica as a loving mother who had always done her best for her children, and the devastation they felt at her death was palpable. They also spoke about the anger and confusion they felt towards David. How could he have done this to his own family? Throughout the trial, David remained eerily calm. He did not speak much, and when he did, his words were often disconnected from the gravity of the situation. He seemed to have accepted the inevitable. He knew that his fate was sealed. There was no escaping the truth of his actions. In one of the few moments of emotion he displayed during the trial, David broke down in tears as he listened to the victim impact statements. His sobs, however, seemed more like the tears of a man consumed by guilt and regret, rather than remorse for his actions. It was clear that David's mental health had deteriorated beyond repair, but this did little to ease the suffering of those who had lost everything. As the trial came to a close, the jury deliberated for several hours before returning with their verdict. David Chadwick was found guilty of all charges: first-degree murder for the deaths of Jessica and the children, as well as other related charges. The courtroom was silent as the verdict was read, the gravity of the situation hanging heavy in the air. David's face was unreadable, his eyes hollow and distant, as if the reality of what he had done had long since ceased to affect him. The sentencing hearing followed shortly thereafter, where the family members of the victims had the opportunity to address the court. Jessica's parents spoke of their heartbreak and the deep void that would never be filled. They described how their world had been turned upside down by David's actions, and how they had been left to mourn the loss of their daughter and grandchildren. David's attorneys argued for a more lenient sentence, citing his mental health struggles, but the prosecution pushed for the maximum sentence. The judge, having heard both sides, ultimately sentenced David Chadwick to life in prison without the possibility of parole. He would never be free again, and he would never again be able to harm anyone. The sentence, though it could never bring back Jessica and the children, was a small measure of justice for the family and the community that had been devastated by his actions. In the aftermath of the trial, life in Benton slowly began to return to normal, but the scars of the tragedy would never fade. The people of Benton, once united by their small-town charm and close-knit community, were now forever changed by the events of that fateful night. David's capture and conviction brought some sense of closure, but the wounds left by his actions ran deep. The Chadwick family was left to rebuild their lives in the face of an unimaginable loss. No amount of justice could ever undo the pain they felt, and no sentence could ever bring back what had been taken from them. For David, the reality of his fate had set in. He would spend the rest of his life behind bars, a man broken by his own demons. His mental health issues may have contributed to his actions, but they did not absolve him of the responsibility for the destruction he had caused. As the years went by, Benton would heal. The memory of Jessica and her children would live on in the hearts of those who had known them, and the community would remember the tragic events that had forever altered their lives. But the question remained, could David have been saved? Was there something that could have been done to prevent this tragedy? The answers would never come, and in the end, it was just another painful chapter in the story of a man who had lost everything. Conclusion. The Chadwick family murders serve as a haunting reminder of the fragility of mental health and the devastating consequences that can result when it is left untreated. David Chadwick's descent into madness led him to commit an act so horrific that it left a lasting scar on everyone involved. While his capture and conviction provided some sense of justice, it could never bring back the lives lost that night. For those who knew Jessica, her children, and David, the memory of that fateful night would forever linger. It was a night that changed everything, a night when love turned to rage and a family was destroyed in the blink of an eye. The tragedy of the Chadwick family will never be forgotten, and it will continue to serve as a stark reminder of the importance of mental health awareness and the consequences